It was a dark day for Elvis Presley. The year was 1965, and the king of rock and roll was about to release what many would later call his worst album ever. The LP, titled Harum Scarum, was a collection of songs that seemed to have been thrown together with little care or thought. It was as if someone had taken a bunch of mediocre tunes, tossed them in a blender, and pressed blend without a second thought. Elvis had always been known for his powerful voice and his ability to turn even the most ordinary song into something magical. But Harum Scarum was different. From the moment the needle hit the vinyl, it was clear that something was off. The melodies were pleasant, but the lyrics were often clunky and the arrangements felt uninspired. It was like listening to a cover band trying to sound like Elvis, but failing miserably. Take the song Golden Coins, for example. The verses were nice, and Elvis made the most of them, but the bridge was awkward and clumsy. It was as if the songwriters had run out of ideas, and just threw in some random lines to fill the space. Elvis, who usually brought his A-game to every performance, seemed to struggle with the material, and it showed. But the real disappointment came with So Close Yet So Far. This song had the potential to be a standout, but Elvis seemed to be having a tough time with it. In the first verse, he missed a note on the word slip, and it was clear that even the production team didn't notice or care. It was a small mistake, but it was enough to take the listener out of the moment and remind them that this wasn't the Elvis they knew and loved. There were a couple of bright spots, though. Animal Instinct was a funky track with an unexpected jazz flute solo, and it was actually kind of catchy. But even this song had its issues, especially in the bridge, where the lyrics and the music just didn't seem to fit together. It was like the songwriters had a good idea, but didn't know how to finish it. Another song, Wisdom of the Ages, was a typical ballad, but it lacked the emotional depth that Elvis usually brought to his music. The lyrics were forgettable, and the ending felt abrupt and unsatisfying. It was as if the songwriter, Florence Kay, had written the lyrics in a hurry and didn't put much thought into them. She later admitted that she wrote the lyrics in just 15 minutes, which explained a lot. The album also included 2 bonus tracks, Animal Instinct and Wisdom of the Ages, which were originally meant for a film but didn't make the final cut. These songs, while not great, were at least a bit more interesting than the rest of the album. Animal Instinct had a funky vibe, and Wisdom of the Ages had a few moments where Elvis's voice shone through, even if the overall song was a bit lackluster. But the real problem with Harum Scarum wasn't just the songs themselves. It was the fact that Elvis, who had been a musical force for a decade, seemed to have lost his edge. He was 10 years into his career, and instead of demanding better material, he seemed content to just go through the motions. It was a far cry from the early days when he was revolutionizing music with hits like Heartbreak Hotel and Hound Dog. The album was a letdown, and it wasn't just the fans who noticed. Critics panned it, and even Elvis himself probably knew that he could do better. But the music industry was changing, and the pressure to keep churning out albums and movies was intense. Harum Scarum was a product of that pressure, and it showed. Despite its flaws, Harum Scarum was still an Elvis album, and that meant something to his fans. They kept buying it, hoping that the next one would be better. But for now, the king was in a creative slump, and it was painful to watch. Elvis was having a tough time in the mid-1960s. His voice, once so powerful and smooth, was struggling. In Paradise Hawaiian style, he sounded off, with a thick, heavy tone that was far from his best. The songs weren't helping either. They were weak, with no real melody, and it showed. Scratch My Back had an interesting bass line, but the lyrics were filled with clichés. Stop Where You Are was so silly, it sounded like it was written by a kid. House of Sand was forgettable, and This Is My Heaven was a slow Hawaiian-style ballad, but even that couldn't save it from sounding dull. Sand Castles was a bit better, but it wasn't the same Elvis from a few years back. His voice was too heavy, and it didn't have the high notes that made his earlier work so special. The only bright spot was Drums of the Islands, which had a big finish with what seemed like half of Hawaii's population on screen. But it was clear that Paradise Hawaiian style was trying too hard to be like Blue Hawaii, and falling short in every way. The script, songs, and direction were all weak, and Elvis looked and sounded terrible. Strangely, the reviews were mostly positive. One critic called it a pleasant hot weather diversion, but it felt more like they hadn't actually seen the film. Another reviewer from Variety praised Drums of the Islands, but their comments were starting to sound like a broken record. By this time, many publications weren't even bothering to review Elvis's films. In the same month, RCA released Elvis for Everyone, a collection of old, unreleased recordings. The album was meant to celebrate 10 years with RCA, but it looked more like a cash grab. The cover showed Elvis sitting in front of a cash register, and the back had pictures of his best-selling albums with the money they made. Despite this, the album was actually quite enjoyable, and did better than the recent soundtracks. However, it only reached #10 on the charts, which was the lowest since His Hand in Mine. In February 1966, Elvis went into the studio to record songs for Spin Out. It was a step up from the previous year, but still not great. Smorgasbord was one of the worst, comparing women to a buffet. Am I Ready was better, with a nice melody, but Elvis's voice still had issues. All That I Am had a Latin rhythm, and while it wasn't as good as his earlier work, it showed he was trying. Stop, Look, and Listen was a bit more energetic, but it still felt forced. The title song, Spin Out, had the same problem: too many car references that wore thin quickly. I'll Be Back was a moderate rocker, and Elvis seemed committed, but it was nothing special. Adam and Evil was a fun, novelty rock song, which was a refreshing change. The other songs were standard movie tunes, but Elvis tried his best, even if the lyrics were silly. When Spin Out was released, the 3 bonus tracks got more attention than the soundtrack. They were recorded in May 1966 and showed a new direction for Elvis. This period from 1966 to 1968 is often overlooked, but it was crucial. While he was still recording soundtracks, he also started working on non-soundtrack material again. In 1966, he recorded How Great Thou Art, his first Grammy-winning album, and tried out new styles and ideas. The private recordings from 1966 were a treasure trove. They showed Elvis experimenting with country music, gospel, and even crooning with a full orchestra. He sang Tennessee Waltz beautifully, and his version of Fools Rush In was much better than the later country version. He also tried out close harmonies and even played piano, giving a powerful performance of If I Loved You from Carousel. These recordings showed that Elvis was not just going through the motions. He was exploring new sounds and styles, laying the groundwork for his comeback. The road to the Elvis special on NBC in 1968 started here in 1966. It wasn't just one special that brought Elvis back, it was a gradual process. These private recordings and the non-soundtrack material were the beginning of a new chapter in Elvis's career. They showed that he was still passionate about music and willing to try new things, even when his film work was lacking. This period is important to understand because it was the foundation for the Elvis we remember from the late 1960s and 1970s. Elvis Presley's music changed a lot in the mid-1960s. After years of making songs for his movies, he returned to the recording studio with a new sound. This new sound was deeper, more emotional, and showed that Elvis had grown as a person and an artist. On May 25 to 28, 1966, Elvis went back to the studio to record gospel music. This was a big deal because it had been almost 6 years since he last recorded non-movie songs. Elvis's new producer, Felton Jarvis, helped him create a sound that was more mature and powerful. The album they made, How Great Thou Art, won Elvis his first Grammy Award. The first song on the album, How Great Thou Art, sounds very different from Elvis's earlier work. His voice was fuller and had more depth. The song has a slow, swinging feel that was new for Elvis. He sang it with a group of talented backup singers, including the Jordanaires and the Imperials. Even though some of the mixes sounded a bit muddy, Elvis's singing was still amazing. Another standout track is Stand By Me. This song is simple but powerful. Elvis sings it with just a piano, and the arrangement is like a conversation between him and the choir. It's a song about needing someone to stand by you, and Elvis delivers it with a lot of emotion. It's clear that he had experienced a lot of life and could connect with the lyrics in a way he couldn't before. The second side of the album has more upbeat songs. So High is a joyful gospel number, and Where Could I Go But to the Lord blends gospel with a blues feel. By and By, and If the Lord Wasn't Walking by My Side have a rock feel, which was unusual for gospel music at the time. Elvis sounds like he's having a lot of fun with these songs. The last song on the album, Where No One Stands Alone, is another emotional highlight. Elvis sings it with a vulnerable, heartfelt voice, and it's a fitting end to the album. In addition to the gospel songs, Elvis recorded some secular tracks during these sessions. Tomorrow Is a Long Time is one of his best performances. It's a slow, country blues song that builds in intensity. Elvis's voice is beautiful and full of yearning. It's a shame this song wasn't released as a single because it shows how relevant and current Elvis still was. Love Letters is another highlight. It's a cover of a classic song, and Elvis's vocal is so good that it makes the song feel fresh. Beyond the Reef is a Hawaiian ballad that Elvis recorded with his friends, and Down in the Alley is a raucous blues number that shows a different side of Elvis. The sessions in June 1966 were focused on making a Christmas single. Elvis didn't show up on the first day because he said he had a cold, so his friend Red West did the initial vocals. When Elvis finally recorded his parts, he gave some of his best performances. Indescribably Blue and I'll Remember You are beautiful ballads that show Elvis's voice at its best. If Every Day Was Like Christmas is a lovely Christmas song that, despite being well sung, didn't become a hit. These sessions marked a turning point for Elvis. He showed that he could still create great music and connect with his audience in a meaningful way. The road to his comeback had begun, and the world was about to see a new, more mature Elvis Presley. In late May and early June 1966, Elvis had achieved a lot, but he still had to go back to the studio to record more soundtracks. This must have been a bit disheartening for him. The film was called Double Trouble, and the title was fitting because there were two big problems with the soundtrack. First, the songs weren't very good. Second, the sound quality was really bad. Critics didn't like Double Trouble at all. John Russell Taylor from The Times wrote that the movie was so childish that it seemed to be made for idiot children. Carol Dane from The Blade said it was only good for Toledo teenagers on a slow afternoon. Lorraine Alterman in the Detroit Free Press called it a real moaner. Even Bosley Crowther from the New York Times, who usually liked Elvis, thought it was just pretty fair. The title song, Double Trouble, was written by Doc Pomus and Mort Schumann, who usually wrote really good songs, but this one was pretty bad. The sound was muddy, and the arrangement wasn't sure if it was rock and roll or a TV sitcom theme. Elvis probably related to the lyrics, which talked about always feeling like he couldn't make the grade, especially after all he had achieved recently. The best song on the soundtrack was City by Night, which had a jazz vibe and a late nightclub feel. Elvis put some effort into it, but his voice wasn't at its best, and the recording quality was terrible. The opening trombone solo set a seedy atmosphere, but the mix was so bad that you could barely hear the band. Long-Legged Girl with the Short Dress On was the single from the session. It had some life to it, but it felt forced, especially with Elvis yelling encouragement to the band at the beginning. The public didn't care much, and the single only reached #63 on the charts. I Love Only One Girl tried to copy the success of Did Ya Ever from GI Blues, but it was just a mediocre attempt. It worked a bit better in the film where it was like a cheap production number, but on the record it was flat. Elvis even sang Old MacDonald on the back of a truck full of chickens. The problem wasn't the song itself, but the arrangement and Elvis's lack of enthusiasm. It ended up being one of the biggest failures in his legacy. It seemed like Elvis was at a standstill. He didn't seem to care about the material he was recording, but he also didn't demand better songs. The remaining songs were just average. Could I Fall in Love was a nice little ballad, but the recording was full of hiss. Baby If You'll Give Me All of Your Love was a formulaic rocker, and Elvis sounded half asleep. There's So Much World to See was decent, but the added strings diluted the bluesy feel. It Won't Be Long was the best up-tempo song, but it still wasn't great. The album reached only #47 in the US charts, which was Elvis's lowest placement up to that point. Even Billboard was getting impatient, saying, "Can you believe he even sings a version of Old MacDonald? Only Presley could get away with it." But he didn't. In September 1966, Elvis recorded the soundtrack for Easy Come, Easy Go. Howard Thompson from the New York Times tried to be kind, saying Elvis must have been tired because he had just got married. But the film was actually shot before the marriage. Thompson complained about the lack of songs, but he might have been mistaken about the number of songs in the film. Variety gave the film a longer review, praising the formula of Elvis's movies. They said the stories made sense, the songs were better, and the production values were high. They even predicted that Elvis movies would be film festival items in the future, but that never happened. Elvis movies are a time capsule of the 1960s, but they never reached cult status. They were poor despite having good casts, budgets, and crews, mostly because of laziness and apathy. Easy Come, Easy Go had no ballads, which was unusual. The title song was the best, with a bit of life and a decent brass section. The Love Machine was bland, and You Gotta Stop had a promising start but was forgettable. Sing You Children was a gospel number that worked well, and Elvis looked more relaxed in this movie. I'll Take Love was professionally done but bland. She's a Machine was cut from the film but was one of the better songs. Yoga Is As Yoga Does was one of the most ridiculous things Elvis ever recorded, with lyrics that poked fun at yoga. The soundtrack EP failed to chart, signaling that the formulaic films and soundtracks were coming to an end. In February 1967, things were getting worse for Elvis. Indescribably Blue only reached #33, and the Spinout single only hit #40. The Easy Come, Easy Go EP didn't chart at all. The only bright spot was the Gospel LP, which reached #18 and became a perennial seller. Clambake was another disappointing film. It didn't look very good, and had basic continuity errors. Critics said it was a silly, tired little frolic. The title song was catchy, and based on the nursery rhyme, Shortenin' Bread. Elvis's voice sounded more natural, but it wasn't commercial gold. The formula was running out of steam, and it was clear that something had to change. The album Clambake is a mixed bag, and its songs reflect the ups and downs of Elvis's career during this period. One of the most criticized tracks is Who Needs Money, a duet with Ray Walker. The song is a disaster, with Walker's performance not helping, and the obvious fact that Elvis and Walker weren't even in the studio together. Elvis's attempts to interact with his invisible duet partner sound forced and unconvincing. The song drags on for nearly 3.5 minutes, making it even more painful to listen to. A House That Has Everything is a step up, but it's still not great. Despite this, Will Friedwald, a music critic, sees it as a hidden gem. He praises the song for its simplicity and beauty, saying it's one of Elvis's most effective ballads. Friedwald argues that Elvis imbues the song with a yearning quality that would impress any top male pop singer. He even suggests that it's one of the prettiest things Presley ever sang, worth at least half a dozen of his earlier 3-chord rock numbers. Confidence is another weak point on the album. It's a rehash of High Hopes, a song that was a hit for Frank Sinatra years earlier. Elvis sounds awful here, with a remarkably husky voice that doesn't suit the song. Most people probably skip this track, moving the needle over it to get to something better. Hey 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 is a rock and roll number about cleaning boats, which sounds as ridiculous as it is. The lyrics are bizarre, but if you ignore them, the music is decent. However, it's hard to ignore the references to goop and elbow grease, and not wonder why Elvis was singing about such mundane tasks. The Girl I Never Loved is a breath of fresh air. It's a pretty ballad, and Elvis sings it with passion and honesty. The mix isn't great, but Elvis's vocal at the end of each verse is powerful and moving. Unfortunately, the song is over before you know it, lasting less than 2 minutes. How Can You Lose What You Never Had is a bluesy mid-tempo song. Elvis's voice is husky again, but the song is arguably the best on the album. The use of an organ instead of a piano adds a funky touch, making it stand out. Despite its quality, it was cut from the film, which is a shame. Another highlight from this session is You Don't Know Me, a country standard. Elvis's version is pleasant, but he knew he could do better and re-recorded it a few months later for the LP. The original attempt is nice, but it doesn't quite hit the mark. The Clambake LP is a bit of a roller coaster. On one hand, you have awful songs like who needs money and confidence, and on the other, you have great tracks like Guitar Man and Big Boss Man. Variety magazine dismissed the album as a typical Presley outing, but their praise for confidence suggests they didn't listen past the first track. Moving on to the movie Speedway. It's one of the better Elvis films of the era. While it's not a masterpiece, it's more enjoyable than most of his other films from this period. The budget seems higher, and Elvis gets to sing a couple of decent tunes. However, critics weren't overly impressed. Renata Adler of the New York Times wrote that the film makes no great use at all of one of the most talented, important, and durable performers of our time. Kevin Thomas of the Los Angeles Times also had harsh words, calling the film uninspired and too much of an imitation of too many of his previous movies. The pairing of Elvis with Nancy Sinatra was seen as a potential draw, but the film's script was weak. Despite this, the film had some funny scenes, and the direction by Norman Taurog managed to make some of the silliness work. Monthly Film Bulletin summed it up as a standard Presley vehicle, with dances, songs, bad studio sets, and a few stock car racing sequences. The soundtrack for Speedway is another mixed bag. The title song is terrible, with a poor melody and a cluttered arrangement that drowns out Elvis's voice. There Ain't Nothing Like a Song isn't much better, with a muddy vocal and an obvious overdub of Nancy Sinatra. Your Time Hasn't Come Yet, Baby is better recorded and received a charming performance from Elvis, but it only reached #71 in the US charts. Who Are You is bland and unmemorable, with a gentle sax solo by Boots Randolph being the highlight. Five Sleepy Heads has a decent melody, but it's taken from Brahms's Lullaby. The song was cut from the film, but remains on the album. Despite its inconsequential nature, it's a pleasant and charming track. Let Yourself Go is the most substantial song from the session, with an arrangement similar to Nightlife. While it suffers from a poor instrumental break, Elvis's committed performance shows he could still be fully engaged with good material. Suppose is a morose ballad that Elvis liked, but it was deleted from the film. The song is well sung, but depressing, and lacks commercial appeal. He's Your Uncle, Not Your Dad is a song about income tax, and it's one of the most infamous tracks on the album. In the film, it's a surreal dance routine that's more entertaining than the song itself. On record, it's a disaster, but Elvis looks disgruntled and unenthusiastic in the film. The soundtrack needed extra material, so Nancy Sinatra was given a chance to sing Your Groovy Self, which is better than most of Elvis's contributions. The bonus tracks by Elvis, including Western Union, Goin' Home, and Mine, are mediocre. Guitar Man and Big Boss Man stand out, with Guitar Man being a highlight. Elvis's version of Guitar Man is cleaner and clearer than Jerry Reed's original, and it was released as a single. Big Boss Man is a hard-driving blues number that shows Elvis's voice was developing the roughness that would become characteristic of his later work. After these two standout tracks, Elvis recorded Mine, a pretty but bland ballad. It took over 20 takes to get right, but it's not a particularly memorable song. Just Call Me Lonesome is a country standard that sounds outdated even by 1967 standards. Elvis's performance is stuck in a time warp, and it's not as effective as it could be. High Heel Sneakers is a return to the style of the first two songs of the session. It's a rocking 5-minute romp with contributions from Boots, Randolph, and Charlie McCoy on saxophone and harmonica. The song was cut for release and wasted as a B-side, not appearing on an album in America until 1980. Finally, Elvis re-recorded You Don't Know Me for the album. This time he got it right in one take. It's a lovely ballad, but it might have benefited from a more contemporary arrangement. Despite this, it's a strong performance that shows Elvis's ability to deliver even with older material. The Speedway soundtrack, like Clambake, is a mix of good and bad. The best tracks, like Guitar Man and Big Boss Man, show that Elvis still had it when given good material. However, the album's low chart position at #82 suggests that the public wasn't as convinced as the critics. Elvis turned his attention to a single for Easter, choosing We Call on Him, a quiet, sacred song. It was originally intended for the movie Easy Come, Easy Go, but it didn't quite fit the film's upbeat vibe. This song has a similar feel to the first side of the How Great Thou Art album. Elvis sings it with a deep, tender voice, handling the wide-ranging melody well, though it's clear he's not as effortlessly smooth as he once was. The aside of the gospel single was "You'll Never Walk Alone." In this recording, Elvis plays the piano, and the song has a very different feel compared to the hit version by Jerry and the Pacemakers. The final edited version is good, but it pales next to the unedited Take 2, which was later released on the Platinum box set. In this take, Elvis gives a powerful performance, singing the end section repeatedly, as if he can't let go of the song until he's extracted every ounce of meaning from it. He sounds completely drained by the end. Unfortunately, the longer version was set aside in favor of a shorter, spliced version, which is a shame because the longer form allowed Elvis to truly express himself. The session ended with Singing Tree, a pleasant country song. Elvis's harmony vocal is a nice addition, but the song isn't as significant as some of the other tracks recorded during those 2 nights in September 1967. Elvis recorded 9 tracks in total, and they could have formed a strong album that would have shown the public he was still recording quality music. However, the material was divided up and spread over single sides and as bonus tracks on the last couple of soundtrack albums. This decision is still puzzling, even after 50 years, and it contributes to why this period of Elvis's work is often overlooked. 3 weeks later, on October 1st, 1967, Elvis was back in the studio to record songs for the comedy western Stay Away, Joe. The movie was based on a 1953 novel by Don Cushman, and it took over a decade for MGM to bring it to the screen. The film was originally intended to be a big-budget Broadway musical, but it failed, and the screen version was shelved until it was revived for Elvis in 1967. Elvis recorded 3 songs by Sid Wayne and Ben Weissman. The first was the title track, a brief, raucous hoedown that was pleasant, but had no life outside the film. The second song, All I Needed Was the Rain, was better. It had a country blues sound similar to the singles from a few weeks earlier. Elvis's vocal is lovely, but the song is too short and tied to the film. The third song, Dominic, was not released at the time. It's a silly song about an impotent bull, and it's as bad as it sounds. The movie itself received poor reviews, with critics noting its outdated portrayal of American Indians and its lack of substance. In January 1968, Elvis returned to the studio to record a song for Stay Away, Joe. The chosen song was Stay Away, a reworking of the English folk song Greensleeves. The up-tempo version that became the master is pleasant, and Elvis clearly loved the melody, digging deep during the chorus. Another song, Goin' Home, was also recorded, but Elvis was distracted and it took 30 takes to get it right. Too Much Monkey Business, a Chuck Berry song, was also recorded, but Elvis's vocal seemed uninspired. The final song, U.S. Mail, in a talking blues country style, became a hit in the UK but failed to chart in the US. On March 7, 1968, Elvis recorded 4 songs for the movie, Live a Little, Love a Little. A new approach was taken, with the songs arranged in advance by Billy Strange and Elvis, recording with a full orchestra for the first time. Almost in Love is a bossa nova song by Luis Bonfa, and despite a somewhat Muzak-like arrangement, Elvis's vocal stands out. Edge of Reality is a funky, psychedelic song that works better on record than in the film. A Little Less Conversation was later remixed and became a hit in 2002, but the original is a solid, funky recording. Wonderful World is a bright, easy-listening song that, while pleasant, lacks the substance of the other tracks. The film Live a Little, Love a Little was another attempt to change the direction of Elvis's career. It received mixed reviews, with some critics noting its attempt to create a more sophisticated setting for Elvis, while others found it mediocre. Despite the poor box office in America, the film did receive some positive reviews even years later. Just 4 months after recording the Live a Little, Love a Little soundtrack, Elvis started work on his TV special for NBC. This show, which would become known as the Comeback Special, was a pivotal moment in his career. However, the seeds of his resurgence were already being sown during these pre-comeback years, as evidenced by the quality of the material he was recording. Interest in Elvis had also increased, with more media attention and interviews, suggesting that his comeback was not just a result of the TV special, but a culmination of his ongoing efforts in the studio. The year 1968 was a turning point for Elvis Presley. After a series of less successful films and a lull in his music career, something began to change. People started to take notice of him again, and the media began to show a renewed interest in the man and the artist. In one article, Elvis talked about the essence of rock and roll. He said that even though the music had evolved with better recordings and arrangements, the beat was still the heart of it all. He pointed out that if you looked at the charts and listened to the top songs, you'd see that rock and roll was still alive and kicking, even if it was a bit more refined. Elvis also opened up about his roles in movies. He mentioned that in Speedway, he played a millionaire Playboy race driver, a role he had played many times before. This role and others like it had become a bit of a joke, but it was part of his life as a movie star. What made this period different was that the media began to treat Elvis more seriously. A writer named C. Robert Jennings interviewed Elvis, his manager Colonel Parker, director Norman Taurog, and Nancy Sinatra. For once, the article wasn't just fluff. It delved into Elvis's thoughts on music, God, and loneliness. Elvis talked about his love for gospel and country music, mentioning artists like Sister Rosetta Tharpe and Johnny Ray. It was clear that Elvis was more serious about his music than he had been in a long time. The renewed interest in Elvis wasn't just about his music, it was also about his movies. Elvis admitted that he no longer made Elvis Presley pictures, suggesting a shift in the types of films he was willing to do. He even talked about why he never attended the Academy Awards, saying he would only go if he got a nomination. Interestingly, Elvis had been invited to perform at the Academy Awards, but he declined, possibly due to his manager's advice. This decision might have cost Elvis some valuable publicity, but it was a reflection of the control his manager had over his career. Despite the difficulties, some journalists managed to get close to Elvis. Vernon Scott, for example, wrote several articles about Elvis that summer. He described a more relaxed and confident Elvis, one who had grown out of his youthful brashness. Scott noted that Elvis was planning to return to live performances, a move that would give him the personal contact with his audience that he had missed. These articles and interviews suggested that Elvis was at a crossroads. He was no longer content with just making movies and collecting paychecks. He wanted to perform again, to connect with his fans, and to reclaim his status as a musical icon. One of the most significant events of this period was the TV special Elvis, recorded in June 1968, which aired in December of the same year. The show had a unique structure, mixing live performances with production numbers. It began with Elvis in a black leather suit, declaring that, if you're looking for trouble, you came to the right place. This set the tone for the rest of the show, which featured a mix of old and new songs. The live segments were powerful. Elvis performed Lottie Miss Claudie with a bluesy edge, and Baby What You Want Me to Do, with such energy that he performed it multiple times during the taping. The ballads like Can't Help Falling in Love and Love Me Tender were especially moving, with new arrangements that added depth and emotion. The production numbers, like the gospel medley, were more polished but still showcased Elvis's passion. The medley included songs like Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child and Saved, where Elvis's commitment to the music was undeniable. Even though the show had its flaws, it was a powerful statement that Elvis was back. The TV special, combined with the renewed interest from the media, set the stage for Elvis's return to live performances. In 1969, he started performing at the International Hotel in Las Vegas, marking his comeback to the stage. This period was a rebirth for Elvis, a time when he reclaimed his place as one of the greatest performers in the world. Elvis put his heart and soul into his 1968 TV special, making it a comeback that no one would forget. He performed with a mix of raw energy and playfulness, especially in the sit-down segments. One of the most talked about moments was his version of Blue Christmas, a song that was only included because Colonel Parker insisted on a Christmas song. When the special was shown again the next year, a much better song, Tiger Man, took its place. Elvis really let loose with Tiger Man, singing, rasping, and growling through it, making it the first song from the taping to be released on record. During the sit-down segments, Elvis couldn't resist singing One Night over and over. He performed it 3 times in the unedited concert sequences, and it was clear he was having a blast. He mostly stuck to the original, more raw lyrics, rather than the sanitized version from his hit single. Elvis then sang a new song called Memories, which had a smooth but overly sweet sound. It didn't quite fit with the rest of the show, which was all about Elvis returning to his rock and roll roots. One of the most ambitious parts of the show was the Guitar Man medley. It told the story of a musician's rise to fame through a series of songs. Unfortunately, 2 songs, Let Yourself Go and It Hurts Me, were cut due to time and censorship. The medley started with a mysterious and surreal snippet called Nothingville, which was a shame because it could have been something special if it had been fully developed. The medley had its ups and downs. Elvis's version of Big Boss Man was grittier than the studio version, but the orchestration was a bit cheesy. Let Yourself Go worked better, even though the visuals were uncomfortable. The most hilarious part was when Elvis mimed to It Hurts Me, while doing karate moves. Despite the mixed quality, the medley ended strong with Elvis singing Guitar Man with new lyrics during the stand-up show, tying everything together nicely. The special ended with Elvis in a white suit, standing alone on a Stark stage, singing If I Can Dream. It was a powerful moment, both musically and visually. Elvis's performance was a plea for tolerance and understanding, reflecting the turmoil of the times. It was a different side of Elvis, and he never performed it again, even though it could have been a great closing number. The TV special was a musical statement about who Elvis was and what he stood for. It showed him as a rock, country, and blues singer, and as a complex artist. The final song, If I Can Dream, was a soul-bearing moment. Critics praised Elvis's growth and maturity, with some seeing it as a sign of his broader talent. Over the years, more of the music and footage from the special were released, including the unedited live segments and the dressing room rehearsals. These gave a behind-the-scenes look at Elvis's creative process. He revisited songs he had struggled with in the past, like When It Rains It Really Pours, and That's When Your Heartaches Begin, showing his persistence and dedication. Despite mixed reviews at the time, the TV special's reputation grew over the years. It is now considered a classic, a moment in TV history that showcased Elvis's raw talent and charm. The process of making the show itself energized Elvis, and he soon announced his return to live performances. In October and November 1968, Elvis worked on songs for the Western film Charo. The title song was a big, dramatic Western theme, and Elvis delivered it with confidence. Another song, Let's Forget About the Stars, was a pretty tune about astrology, but it wasn't used in the film. The movie itself was a disappointment, with Elvis giving one of his worst performances. Critics were harsh, but some found a few positive things to say, like Elvis's physical appearance and his attempt to give a credible performance. Elvis's next film, The Trouble with Girls, had been in the works since 1961. It's a film that still divides opinion. Some see it as a fun, if flawed, movie, while others find it tedious. Despite the varying reviews, it's clear that Elvis was always trying to push himself, even if the results weren't always what he or his fans hoped for.